There is a sound a horse makes when it dies on a spear, not the scream of battle, something deeper, more terrible, a wet sound, the sound of lungs puncturing, of muscle tearing against sharpened iron. I heard that sound 1,000 times at Bannockburn, standing in the second rank of the Schiltron, my pike braced against the earth as English destriers hurled themselves onto our wall of steel. The smell reached me before the sound, the hot copper stink of horse blood mixing with the sweeter rot of punctured bowels, the acrid reek of men voiding themselves in terror. I was 19 years old. I thought I understood death. I understood nothing. They called what we did that day glorious. God knows what to call it. I know only that I stood in a press of bodies so tight I could not fall if I tried, that I felt the shock of impact travel up my pike and into my shoulders until my whole body became an instrument of killing. I watched men I had known since childhood disappear into the chaos and never return. Glory, perhaps. But glory tastes like blood and smells like shit and feels like the weight of armor on exhausted shoulders. I was there when Scotland won its freedom. I stood at Bannockburn on the 24th day of June in the year of our Lord, 1314, in the Schiltron commanded by the Black Douglas himself. My name is Malcolm of Fife, son of a merchant who could afford to equip me with mail and a proper helm, and I had trained for 3 years in the Schiltron discipline that Robert the Bruce had perfected. I thought I knew what battle would be. I was wrong about that too. To understand how we came to that field, how a ragged Scottish army defeated the largest English force ever to invade our land, I must go back 3 years. I was 16 when I joined Bruce's army in the spring of 1311, when the king was still consolidating his power and English garrisons still held most of Scotland's castles. My father had prospered under English occupation. He traded wool and hides through Berwick, but he was Scottish in his heart. And when Bruce began winning, when it seemed possible that Scotland might truly be free, he equipped me as a spearman. I remember the walk to the training ground that first morning, the weight of the mail shirt my father had commissioned, the strangeness of the iron helm that made my head feel twice its normal size. I remember the pike, 12 feet of ashwood with an iron point, heavier than I had imagined, awkward in hands accustomed to quills and account books. I remember thinking I had made a terrible mistake. The man who taught me to fight was called Red Donald, a veteran of Loudon Hill, where Bruce had first proved the Schiltron could stop English cavalry. He was perhaps 40 years old, missing 3 fingers on his left hand where an English sword had caught him. He had the patience of a stonemason teaching an apprentice. He lined us up that first day, perhaps 60 of us, farm boys and merchants' sons, and a few minor gentry who could not afford horses. He walked the line correcting our grips on the pikes. Too high and you lose leverage, too low and you cannot brace against impact. The pike must become an extension of your body, he said, must move as naturally as your own arm. We drilled for weeks. The Schiltron is not a simple thing, though it looks simple from outside. A circular or square formation of spearmen with pikes pointing outward like the spines of a hedgehog. The difficulty is in the discipline, in standing when every instinct screams to run, in holding formation when horses are thundering toward you and men are dying on either side. Red Donald taught us to trust the man beside us, to move as one body, to understand that the Schiltron holds or breaks together. A single man breaking formation kills everyone around him. I learned to sleep in mail, to march 20 miles carrying pike and shield and supplies, to eat whatever could be found, and drink water that tasted of mud and worse. I learned the songs the veterans sang, learned which commanders were worth following and which would get you killed through stupidity. I learned that the romance of war exists only in ballads, that the reality is boredom and exhaustion punctuated by moments of absolute terror. By the summer of 1313, I had fought in 3 small engagements, skirmishes really, against English foraging parties and garrison troops. I had killed 2 men that I knew of, felt the resistance of flesh against pike point, seen the light go out of eyes that had been alive moments before. I had learned to live with that, to sleep despite the memories, to understand that this was the price of freedom. And I had learned to believe in Robert the Bruce. I never spoke to him directly. I was common infantry, he was the king. But I saw him often enough, riding along the columns on his small horse, stopping to speak with veterans, checking that men had food and dry places to sleep. He was not like the English lords I had seen in Berwick, remote and contemptuous. He was a soldier who happened to be king, and he understood that an army marches on its belly and fights with its spirit. The news came in winter of 1313 during the siege of Perth. The king's brother Edward had besieged Stirling Castle and negotiated terms with the English garrison. They would surrender by midsummer 1314, if not relieved by an English army. It seemed like a clever move at first, a bloodless way to capture Scotland's most strategic fortress. Then we understood what it meant. King Edward of England could not allow Stirling to fall without responding. His barons would call him weak. His father's legacy would be tarnished. His claim to overlordship of Scotland would become meaningless. Edward Bruce's bargain had forced the English king's hand. He would have to invade with everything he had. We spent the spring of 1314 preparing. Bruce chose the ground carefully, studying the approaches to Stirling, walking the land around the Bannockburn, examining the woods and the marshy ground and the narrow roads. I did not understand his thinking then. I was a spearman, not a tactician, but I watched him work and I saw the care he took. The king positioned us in the new park near Torwood, wooded ground that would shelter us from English archers and channel their cavalry onto ground of our choosing. He split the army into 4 main battles, the technical term for formations, though we called them Schiltrons. His brother Edward commanded one, Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray, commanded another, James Douglas commanded the third, and the king himself would command the reserve to the south. I was assigned to Douglas's battle, the second rank, with veterans on either side who had fought at Loudon Hill and Glen Trool. Red Donald stood 3 men to my left. A boy named Colin from Dundee stood to my right. He was 17. This was his first real battle, and I could see the fear in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. I told him what Red Donald had told me 3 years before. The fear never goes away. You just learn to stand despite it. The English came in late June, the largest army I had ever seen or would see again. We heard them before we saw them. The sound of thousands of men marching, the rumble of wagons, the jingle of horse harness. Then we saw them. The column stretched beyond sight, banners flying, sunlight glinting off armor and lance points, the great destriers of the English knights stepping high, the archers with their terrible longbows, the infantry in their thousands. Someone near me whispered a prayer. Someone else cursed. I simply stared, trying to count them and failing. Bruce had perhaps 6,000 men. The English had 3 times that, maybe 4. They had heavy cavalry, professional soldiers, the wealth and power of the English crown behind them. We had pikes and determination and ground we had chosen. It did not seem like enough. The first contact came on the 23rd of June, the vigil of St. John's Day, when English cavalry probed our positions. We were not yet formed for battle. Men were still moving into position, the Schiltrons not yet locked tight. I saw English knights approaching, perhaps 100 of them, moving carefully through the trees. Then I saw Robert the Bruce, mounted on his small horse, riding forward to observe them. He was wearing lighter armor than usual, carrying his battle axe rather than a lance. I watched as one of the English knights, a big man on a massive destrier, recognized him and charged. The distance closed impossibly fast. The English knight's lance was leveled, his horse was at full gallop, and Bruce sat there on his small mount like he was waiting for a friend. At the last possible moment, Bruce twisted aside. The lance passed harmlessly. The axe came down. I heard the impact from 50 yards away, heard the crack of the axe blade splitting the knight's helmet and the skull beneath. The English knight, I learned later his name was Henry de Bohun, fell from his horse dead before he hit the ground. The English cavalry pulled back. The Scottish army roared. Bruce rode back to our lines, holding up his axe. The shaft had split from the force of the blow, and he was smiling. That was when I began to believe we might actually win. If the king could kill English knights in single combat, if he would risk himself like that to inspire us, then perhaps we had a chance. The rest of that day passed in confused skirmishing. English cavalry charged our positions several times, testing the Schiltron, trying to find weakness. Each time we held, pikes bristling outward, formation tight. Each time they pulled back. I did not fight that day. My section of the Schiltron was not engaged. But I watched, I learned. I saw how the horses balked at the wall of spikes, how disciplined infantry could turn back even armored knights if they held formation. As darkness fell, both armies settled into nervous camps. We could see English fires in the distance, hundreds of them, spreading across the plain below. We could hear them, the sounds of an army trying to rest, knowing battle would come with dawn. We did not light many fires. Bruce wanted us alert, ready for night attack, and besides, there was little to cook. We had oatcakes and water, nothing more. I lay on damp ground that night, mail shirt still on because taking it off and putting it back on was too much effort, pike beside me, and I tried to sleep. I could not. None of us could. Colin beside me whispered prayers continuously, telling his beads, asking saints I had never heard of for protection. Red Donald checked his pike point for the dozenth time, testing the edge with his thumb. Around me in the darkness, 6,000 men waited for dawn, knowing that tomorrow would be the day, that tomorrow we would either break the English or die trying. I remember the smell of that night. Unwashed bodies, horse dung, the smoke from distant fires, and underneath it all the smell of the earth, rich and dark and alive. I remember thinking that this might be the last night I would spend on God's earth, that tomorrow I might be lying in a different way on this same ground, staring up at nothing. I remember praying, though I was not particularly devout, asking God to let me stand when the moment came, to not shame myself or the men around me, to die well if I had to die. I did not pray for victory. That seemed presumptuous. I prayed only for courage. Dawn came slowly, grey light spreading across the field, revealing the English army stirring in their camps. We had already been awake for hours. Bruce had called his commanders together before first light, and though I could not hear what was said, I saw the result. We would not wait for the English to attack. We would advance. This was madness, surely. You did not advance against superior numbers, against heavy cavalry, against the assembled might of England. You held defensive positions and made them come to you. But Bruce understood something we did not yet grasp. The English army was exhausted from their march, compressed into poor ground between the Bannockburn and the wooded slopes, their cavalry unable to maneuver properly. If we came down from the woods in tight formation, we could strike before they formed proper battle lines. The king sent a priest among us, Abbot Maurice of Incheffray, an old man, nearly blind, who celebrated Mass and blessed us. Then Bruce himself rode along the Schiltrons, speaking loudly enough for all to hear. He reminded us why we fought, reminded us of English occupation, and burned villages, and Scottish nobles hanging from English gibbets. He told us that the English outnumbered us, but we had God, and justice, and the ground beneath our feet. He told us that today, Scotland would be free, or we would die free men, rather than live as slaves. Men cheered. I felt something rising in my chest, something that was not quite courage, but close enough. The drums began to beat. The Schiltrons began to move. We came down from the woods in 4 great blocks of spearmen, pikes raised, banners flying, moving in unison like we had trained for 3 years. I was in the second rank of Douglas's battle, Colin still beside me, Red Donald somewhere to my left, and we marched toward the English army spread out below us. I could see them scrambling to form up, could see cavalry mounting, infantry grabbing weapons, officers shouting orders. They had not expected this. They had expected us to defend, to wait, to let them attack on their terms. We gave them no time. The distance closed, 500 yards, 400. I could see individual faces now, could see the English knights in their magnificent armor, could see the archers trying to find positions where they could shoot without hitting their own cavalry. 300 yards. The front rank lowered pikes to horizontal, the killing position. I lowered mine, feeling the familiar weight, bracing the butt against my hip. 200 yards. The English cavalry charged. This is what I remember. The sound of hooves like thunder, like the end of the world, growing louder and louder until it filled everything. The ground shaking beneath my feet. the wall of armored horses and armored men coming toward us at terrible speed. The man in front of me screaming, not in fear, in defiance, in rage. The moment of impact, the impact when it came, was like being hit by a stone wall that was itself moving. The sound was indescribable. The crash of horseflesh against pike points, the screams of animals dying, the shouts of men, the clang of metal on metal, all of it happening at once, all of it impossibly loud. The horse that hit our section of the line died immediately, 3 pikes through its chest, but its momentum carried it forward, driving it onto our formation. The knight riding it went down in a tangle of armor and thrashing hooves. I never saw his face. The second rank, my rank, stepped forward to fill gaps, pikes thrusting over the shoulders of the front rank. I felt my pike hit something, felt the terrible resistance of flesh and bone, felt the shock travel up the shaft into my arms and shoulders. I pulled back, thrust again, pulled back. There was no time to think, no time for fear or doubt or anything except the pure mechanical action of killing. Thrust, pull, thrust. The man in front of me went down, an English lance through his throat. I stepped into his place, into the front rank now, pike held low and braced. A horse reared up in front of me, hooves flailing. I thrust upward into its belly. It came down on top of the pike, driving it deeper, and the weight was so great I could not pull the weapon free. I let go, grabbed the fallen man's pike, turned to face the next threat. This was what the Schiltron was, not individual combat, but mass killing, a machine made of men and pikes that simply ground forward, inexorable, unstoppable. The English cavalry could not break through, could not get around, could not do anything except die on our spikes or pull back. And they could not pull back because more cavalry was pushing from behind, compressed into the narrow ground between the burn and the woods, unable to maneuver. I saw an English knight on foot, his horse killed beneath him, swinging a sword at the pike wall. He killed 2 men before Red Donald put a pike through his eye slit. I saw another knight surrender, throwing down his sword, screaming for quarter. Someone behind me shouted that we were taking no prisoners today. The knight died on 6 pikes at once. Colin was still beside me, still alive, his face splattered with blood that might have been his own or someone else's. He was making a sound, a continuous keening wail, and his pike moved in and out mechanically like he was threshing grain. I wanted to tell him something, wanted to say that he was doing well, that we were holding, but there was no breath for words. The fighting had a rhythm, cavalry charge, impact, the terrible grinding melee, the English pulling back to regroup, a moment's pause to drag wounded men out of the front rank and bring fresh fighters forward. Then another charge. Again and again. The sun climbed higher. The heat became oppressive, trapped inside mail and helm. I was thirsty beyond description, but there was no water. I was exhausted, my arms and shoulders burning with fatigue, but there was no rest. Men died around me, and I stepped over their bodies and kept fighting, because that was all there was to do. Sometime in the morning, I had lost all sense of time. I saw something that made no sense. The English formation was changing. Instead of organized cavalry charges, it was becoming a mob, a confused press of men and horses, pushing forward without coordination. Then I understood. The English army was so large, compressed into such poor ground, that their own numbers were working against them. The rear ranks were pushing forward, unable to see that the front ranks were already engaged and dying. The whole mass was compacting, becoming denser, and dense meant vulnerable. Bruce saw it too. I heard the horns sound, heard Douglas shouting orders, and our Schiltron began to advance. Not a charge, we maintained formation, but a steady forward pressure, pikes leveled, pushing into the English mass. They could not retreat because their own army blocked retreat. They could not advance because we held firm. They could only die. I stepped on something soft and looked down to see an English archer, still alive, pinned under a dead horse. His face was very young, perhaps 15. He looked up at me with terrified eyes and opened his mouth to beg for mercy. Colin thrust his pike down into the boy's chest without breaking stride. We kept advancing. This is what victory looks like from the inside. Not glory, not triumph, but butchery. The mechanical work of killing men who cannot escape, who are trapped by terrain and their own numbers and the failures of their commanders. I killed men that morning. I stopped counting after the first dozen, and most of them never had a chance to fight back. They were already wounded or trapped or trying to surrender, and we killed them anyway, because that was what the Schiltron did. It ground forward and destroyed everything in its path. I saw the Earl of Gloucester die. I did not know who he was at the time, just another English lord in fine armor, but I saw him unhorsed, saw him struggling to rise under the weight of his plate, saw him disappear under a mass of Scottish spears. Later, I heard the story, how his own knights had abandoned him, how 500 English cavalry had been close enough to save him, and not one had tried. At the time, I only saw a man die badly, and was glad he was English, and not me. The fighting had been going for perhaps 3 hours, when I heard something new in the sound of battle. Not more screaming. There had been screaming since the beginning, but a different quality to it. Fear turning to panic. The English line was breaking. I could see it happening, see men turning to flee, see the organized formations dissolving into individual terror. And then I saw why. King Edward himself was leaving the field, riding south with his bodyguard, abandoning his army. The word spread through the English ranks like fire through dry grass. The king was fleeing. The battle was lost. Every man for himself. What had been an army became a mob. What had been a battle became a massacre. The Schiltrons broke formation. We no longer needed it, and the pursuit began. I ran after fleeing Englishmen, legs burning, lungs screaming for air, chasing them across open ground toward the Bannockburn. Some of them made it to the water and tried to cross. Most drowned, dragged down by armor in water that was only waist deep. I stood on the bank and watched them die and felt nothing. Not pity, not triumph, nothing. I was too tired to feel. The pursuit went on for hours, miles across the countryside. Scottish soldiers hunting down English stragglers, killing some, capturing others for ransom. I stopped after the first mile, too exhausted to continue, and I sat down on a stone and simply breathed. Around me, other men were doing the same, collapsing where they stood, some laughing, some weeping, some silent. Colin sat beside me. He had lost his helm somewhere, and there was a cut across his scalp bleeding freely, but he was smiling. "We won," he kept saying. "We won." I looked back toward the battlefield, at the carpet of bodies stretching across the ground, English and Scottish mixed together, men and horses, the living and the dead sometimes hard to distinguish. I thought about the men I had killed, about the boy archer Colin had speared, about the English knight who had begged for quarter and died anyway. We won. Yes, we had won. But God help me. I was not sure what we had won was worth what it had cost. The sun was past its height when I finally walked back toward the Scottish camp. My legs barely worked, each step an effort of will. I had lost my pike somewhere, had no memory of dropping it. I still had my mail and helm, though the helm was dented on the left side, and I did not remember taking a blow there. The battlefield was being worked over by men looking for valuables, armor, weapons, anything that could be sold. The English baggage train had been captured intact, hundreds of wagons full of supplies and coin and the wealth of the English crown. Men were already talking about the ransoms we would collect for captured nobles, the silver that would flow into Scottish coffers, the proof of God's favour. I found Red Donald near the Douglas Standard, sitting on the ground with his back against a tree, his ruined left hand cradling his right arm. The arm was clearly broken, bent at an angle arms should not bend. He looked up at me and grinned through the pain. "Still alive," he said. "That makes us lucky." I sat down beside him, too tired to speak, and we watched the sun move across the sky and the ravens begin to gather. The victory celebrations began that evening, as word spread through the army that not only had we won the field, but the English king had fled all the way to Dunbar, that English casualties were in the thousands, that Scotland was truly free. Men sang, men drank whatever they could find, men thanked God, and the saints, and Robert the Bruce. I could not celebrate. I kept seeing the boy archer's face, kept feeling the resistance of flesh against pike point, kept hearing the sounds of men dying. Colin tried to get me to drink, to sing, to share in the joy. I told him I was too tired. That was true, but not the truth. The truth was that I had learned something about myself that day, something I did not want to know. I was capable of killing without mercy, without hesitation, without humanity. When the Schiltron advanced and the English were trapped, I had thrust my pike into wounded men, into men trying to surrender, into men who were no threat to me. I had done it mechanically, efficiently, without thought. The Schiltron had made me into a component of a killing machine, and I had played my part perfectly. That night, I dreamed of the battlefield, of walking among bodies that were not quite dead, of faces looking up at me, pleading for help I would not give. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, and I walked out into the darkness to be alone. I found Bruce there, standing at the edge of the camp, looking south toward England. He was alone, which was unusual. Kings are rarely alone, and I almost turned away, not wanting to intrude. But he had heard me and turned, and in the darkness I could not read his expression. "You are Malcolm," he said. "Douglas's Schiltron, second rank." He knew my name. The king knew my name. I stammered something, I cannot remember what, and he gestured for me to join him. We stood together in silence for a while, looking at nothing, and then he spoke. "Today we won our freedom," he said. "Tomorrow we will discover what freedom costs." I did not understand what he meant then. I do now. He was talking about the responsibility of victory, the burden of building something from the ruins of war, the difficulty of turning soldiers back into citizens. But he might also have been talking about the moral cost, the weight of all those deaths, English and Scottish alike, the knowledge that freedom had been purchased with blood and would need to be maintained the same way. Did I do right? I found myself asking. Bringing these men to battle, risking everything on this ground. He was not asking me. He was asking himself, asking God, asking the darkness. I had no answer for him. No one did. After a long silence, he turned to go back to camp, then paused. "You stood well today," he said. "Scotland is free, because men like you held the line." It was meant as a compliment, as recognition. I felt it like an accusation. The days after Bannockburn were strange. The English prisoners were sorted, nobles separated from common soldiers, ransoms calculated. The English baggage train was distributed. Every Scottish soldier received something, coin or equipment or supplies. The English wounded were cared for or killed, depending on the severity of their injuries and the mood of whoever found them. The Scottish dead were buried, mass graves dug north of the burn, prayers said over them by priests who had blessed them before battle. I helped dig those graves, helped carry bodies of men I had known, men who had stood beside me in the Schiltron and would never stand again. We buried Colin on the third day. He had seemed fine after the battle, laughing and celebrating with the rest, but the cut on his scalp had festered, and by the second day he was burning with fever. By the third day, he was dead. Red Donald and I buried him ourselves, in a quiet spot beneath an oak tree, and I said the prayers my father had taught me. He was 17 years old. He had survived the greatest battle in Scottish history and died of an infected wound 3 days later. There was no glory in it, no meaning, just waste. The army began to disperse after a week. There was no point in maintaining a full muster when the English were shattered and fleeing. Men returned to their homes, to farms and towns and families they had not seen in months. I returned to Fife, to my father's house, and I tried to return to the life I had known before. It did not work. My father saw it immediately, saw that something had changed in me. He asked what had happened at Bannockburn, and I told him we had won, and he asked what it cost, and I could not answer. How do you explain to someone who was not there what it feels like to kill a man? How do you describe the sound of the Schiltron grinding forward, the smell of the battlefield after 3 hours of fighting, the the particular expression on a dying man's face when he realizes help is not coming. You cannot. The words do not exist. I tried to return to my father's business, to accounting and trade and the comfortable rhythms of merchant life. I lasted 3 months. Then I went back to the army. I told myself it was duty, that Scotland needed soldiers to garrison the captured castles, to defend against English raids, to maintain the freedom we had won. That was true, but not the whole truth. The truth was that I no longer fit in the ordinary world, that I had become something different at Bannockburn, that the only people who understood me were other men who had stood in the Schiltron and survived. I served in Bruce's army for another 14 years, until age and injuries made me useless for fighting. I was at the siege of Berwick in 1318, at the raids into northern England, at a dozen small actions whose names no one remembers. I killed more men, saw more friends die, learned to live with the weight of it all. I never married, never had children, never built the life my father had imagined for me. The Schiltron had made me into a soldier, and a soldier was all I would ever be. Bruce himself died in 1329, 15 years after Bannockburn, secure in his kingdom and his legacy. I was not there when he died. I was recovering from a wound taken in a border raid, but I heard about it. They said he died peacefully, surrounded by his lords, having achieved everything he had fought for. They said he requested his heart be taken on crusade to the Holy Land, one final act of piety. They said he was at peace. I hope that was true. I hope he found some peace, some sense that the cost had been worth it. I have not. Red Donald died in 1322, killed in a stupid skirmish near Carlisle when an English arrow caught him in the throat. He had survived Bannockburn, survived a dozen other battles, and he died because some English archer got lucky. I buried him near the border, in soil that was neither English nor Scottish, and I thought about how random death is, how little skill or courage matters when an arrow is flying toward your neck. The years have passed. I am old now, nearly 50, which is ancient for a soldier. I live on a small pension from the Crown, in a house near Stirling, and I spend my days doing nothing much. Sometimes former soldiers come to visit, men who served in the Schiltrons, and we talk about Bannockburn, about the day we won Scotland's freedom. We talk about the glory of it, about Bruce's tactical genius, about how we stood against overwhelming odds and triumphed. We do not talk about the boy archer, or the men who begged for quarter, or the sound horses make when they die on pikes. We do not talk about the cost. Young men come sometimes, boys who want to hear war stories, who think battle is glorious and death is meaningful. I tell them what they want to hear, the charges, the victory, the triumph. I do not tell them the truth. What good would it do? They will learn it themselves when their time comes, or they will be lucky and never fight a battle. And either way, my words cannot prepare them. Some things can only be learned through experience. I am writing this in the year of our Lord, 1345, 31 years after Bannockburn. The Scotland I fought for has survived, though not without cost, not without struggle. Edward II is long dead, murdered by his own barons in the end, destroyed as much by his defeat at Bannockburn as by his many failures as a king. His son, the third Edward, has tried to reassert English claims to Scotland, has invaded several times, has won battles and taken castles and accomplished nothing permanent. We endure. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed in 1328, recognized Scottish independence formally, put into law what we had won with blood. It did not last, treaties never do, but for a few years there was peace. There was hope that the fighting might actually end. Then Edward III repudiated it, and the wars began again, and we discovered that freedom is not something you win once, but something you must win again and again, generation after generation. I think about that sometimes, about whether Bannockburn was worth it. 6,000 Scottish soldiers stood on that field, and perhaps 1,000 died, and many more were wounded, and all of us were changed. 10,000 Englishmen died, men who had no quarrel with Scotland beyond what their king commanded, men who might have been farmers or craftsmen or fathers if they had been born in a different time. Was Scottish independence worth 15,000 deaths? Was it worth the boy archer's life, or Colin's, or Red Donald's? I do not know. I know only that freedom mattered enough that we were willing to die for it, and that has to mean something, even if I cannot articulate what. The younger generation does not understand. They have grown up in an independent Scotland, have never known English occupation, have never stood in a Schiltron, wondering if this day would be their last. They take freedom for granted, as perhaps they should. Perhaps that is what we fought for, so that our children and grandchildren would not have to fight, would not have to know what we knew, would not have to pay the price we paid. If so, we failed. The wars continue. The borders are still contested. Young men still die for causes they barely understand. But perhaps we succeeded in some smaller way. Scotland exists. We are not England's vassal. We have our own king, our own laws, our own identity. That is not nothing. That is worth something, even if it is not worth everything we paid. I returned to the battlefield once, about 10 years after the battle, when I was stationed nearby. The ground had recovered. Grass had grown over the scars. The bodies were long buried. Nature had reclaimed the field. I stood where our Schiltron had formed and tried to remember exactly how it had been, but memory is unreliable and time changes things, and I could not be certain I was standing in precisely the right spot. I walked to where the English line had been, where I had thrust my pike into dying men, where Colin had killed the boy archer. There was nothing to mark the place, no sign that thousands had died here, no indication that history had turned on this ground. It was just a field, like any other field, with grass and wildflowers and birds singing. I found that obscene somehow, that the earth could forget so easily, that nature did not care about human struggles, that the ground where men had died in agony would produce flowers the next spring, as if nothing had happened. But perhaps that is right. Perhaps that is how it should be. The earth endures, and life continues, and the dead are forgotten, except by those who loved them. The great battles become stories. The stories become legends. The legends become simplified until all the complexity and pain and moral ambiguity is stripped away, and only the triumph remains. Bannockburn is already becoming a legend. The singers tell it as a tale of heroic victory, of brave Scots defeating tyrannical English, of Robert the Bruce, the perfect king leading his people to freedom. They sing about Bruce killing de Bohun, about the Schiltrons holding against cavalry charges, about the glorious rout of the English army. They do not sing about the boy archer, or the men who drowned in the burn, or the moral cost of victory. That is fine. That is how legends work. But I was there, and I remember, and I am writing this so that someone, someday, will know that the legend is not the whole truth, that victory has a price. That freedom is built on bones and blood, and the broken bodies of men who believed in something larger than themselves. I want someone to know that the men who fought at Bannockburn were not heroes in the way the songs suggest. We were ordinary men, scared and tired and often confused, who stood in the Schiltron because we had been ordered to, because we did not want to shame ourselves before our comrades, because running would get us killed as surely as fighting. We were not particularly brave or noble. We simply did what we had to do, and we survived, or we did not. And those who survived carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. I want someone to know that Robert the Bruce, for all his brilliance as a king and a commander, was a man who sent thousands to their deaths and lived with that knowledge every day afterward. I saw it in his face that night after the battle, when he asked if he had done right. He knew the cost. He paid it in his own way, in sleepless nights and the burden of command, and the knowledge that every decision he made determined whether men lived or died. The crown is a heavy weight, heavier than armor, and he bore it with grace, but he bore it nonetheless. I want someone to know that the English soldiers who died at Bannockburn were not villains, not monsters, just men following orders, fighting for their king, doing what medieval soldiers did. Most of them had never been to Scotland before, knew nothing of our struggle for independence, cared only about survival and getting home to their families. They died because Edward II was a poor king who made bad decisions, because medieval warfare was brutal and chaotic, because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their deaths were not less tragic because they wore English livery. I want someone to know that victory, even total victory, even victory that changes history, does not feel the way you imagine it will. It does not feel glorious or triumphant or noble. It feels like exhaustion and relief, and the slow realization that you survived when others did not. It feels like guilt for being alive, like shame for the things you did to stay alive, like a hollow space where the excitement and fear used to be. Victory feels like the aftermath of a storm. Everything is damaged, everything needs rebuilding, and you are too tired to begin. The celebration comes later, when the adrenaline fades, and the relief sets in and the wine flows. But in the moment of victory itself, standing on a field of corpses with blood on your hands and smoke in your lungs, there is no glory. There is only the terrible knowledge of what you have done and what has been done to others. These are the things the songs do not tell you, the things the legends leave out. These are the things I want someone to remember. My hand shakes now when I write. Age, and old wounds that never healed properly, and my eyes are not what they were. I do not have many years left. When I die, there will be fewer and fewer who remember Bannockburn as it actually was, who stood in the Schiltron and felt the impact of cavalry charges, who killed men face to face and saw the light go out of their eyes. Eventually there will be none, and the legend will be all that remains. Perhaps that is right. Perhaps legends serve a purpose, give people something to believe in, provide a simplified narrative that unites a nation. But before the legend is all that remains, I wanted to set down the truth, or at least my truth, my experience, what I saw and felt and knew. I cannot speak for the whole battle. I was one man in one Schiltron in one part of the field, but I can speak for what I witnessed, and perhaps that is enough. The truth is that Bannockburn was necessary. English occupation was real, English oppression was real, and Robert the Bruce's rebellion was a genuine fight for freedom. The truth is also that Bannockburn was horrible, that thousands of men died in pain and terror, that the victory was built on acts of brutality that would shame us if we thought about them too carefully. Both truths exist simultaneously. The battle was both a glorious victory and a massacre, both a triumph of tactical brilliance and a demonstration of warfare's inhumanity. To deny either truth is to misunderstand what happened. I have thought often about the boy Archer, the one Colin killed. He was English, he was the enemy, and in the logic of war, his death was justified. But he was also 15 years old, trapped under a dead horse, looking up at us with terrified eyes, and we killed him anyway. That was the right decision tactically. Leaving wounded enemy soldiers behind you is dangerous, and we could not spare men to guard prisoners. But it was also murder, the deliberate killing of a helpless child, and no amount of tactical justification changes that. I have carried that boy's face with me for 31 years. I see it sometimes when I close my eyes, see him looking up, see his mouth opening to beg for mercy, see Colin's pike coming down. I did not strike the blow, but I was there. I was part of the machine that killed him, and that makes me responsible. I have confessed this to priests, have been absolved, have been told that war is different, that soldiers cannot be held to the same moral standards as other men. Perhaps. But I do not feel absolved. I feel like a man who killed a child and has been living with it ever since. This is what war does. It creates situations where good men do terrible things, where the necessary and the unforgivable become the same act, where survival requires the abandonment of the moral principles we claim to live by. And then we live with it, carry it inside us, try to reconcile what we did with who we thought we were. Some men manage this better than others. Red Donald seemed largely untroubled. He had compartmentalized, had decided that what happened in war stayed in war and did not touch the rest of his life. I could never do that. For me, it was all one life, and the things I did at Bannockburn were things I did, period. Not separate, not excused, not forgiven by context. I do not know which of us was right. The Scotland I fought for has become something I do not entirely recognize. The generation that fought at Bannockburn is dying off, being replaced by young men who know the battle only as a story, who understand freedom as a birthright rather than something won through blood. They are building lives, raising families, pursuing wealth and status and happiness. This is good. This is what we fought for. But sometimes I feel like a ghost in my own country, a remnant of a past that no longer matters, carrying memories no one wants to hear. The wars with England continue, but they are different now, more political, less existential. Edward III wants to reassert English claims, but he does not want to occupy Scotland, does not want to destroy our identity. It is about prestige and territory and the complex web of medieval politics, not about survival and freedom. The young soldiers fighting these wars do not have the same sense of desperate necessity we had. They fight for their lords, for pay, for glory, perhaps, but not for survival, not for the right to exist. I envy them that, even as I pity them for not understanding what real war is. Sometimes I am asked to speak to soldiers before they go to battle, to share the lessons of Bannockburn, to inspire them with stories of victory. I do my best. I tell them about discipline, about the importance of holding formation, about trust in the men beside you. I tell them about Bruce's tactical genius, about choosing your ground, about using terrain to offset numerical disadvantage. These are useful lessons, practical lessons, things that might keep them alive. I do not tell them about the boy archer. I do not tell them about the sounds men make when they die, about the smell of a battlefield after 6 hours of fighting, about the way victory feels like defeat when you are standing among the bodies of your friends. I do not tell them that some part of them will die in battle, even if their body survives, that they will carry the weight of what they do and see for the rest of their lives, that the old men telling war stories are often the ones most damaged by war. What good would it do? They will learn these things themselves, or they will be lucky enough not to fight. And either way, my words cannot prepare them. The King's steward came to see me last year, bringing a small pension from the Crown, recognition for my service at Bannockburn and in the years after. It was a kind gesture, unnecessary, but appreciated. The steward, a young man who had not been born when the battle was fought, asked me what I remembered most clearly about that day. I almost told him the truth. Almost told him about the boy archer, about the sound of the Schiltron grinding forward, about Bruce's face in the darkness asking if he had done right. Almost told him that the day Scotland won its freedom was the day I lost some essential part of myself, and I have spent the 30 years since trying to find it again. Instead, I told him what he wanted to hear. I told him about the glory of it, about standing shoulder to shoulder with brave men, about the moment when we knew we had won. I told him about Bruce killing de Bohun, about the English rout, about the ransoms and the captured baggage train. I gave him the legend, polished and bright and empty of truth. He thanked me, paid the pension, left satisfied. I stood at the door and watched him ride away, and I thought about the distance between what happened and what we say happened, between memory and history, between truth and legend. The distance is vast, unbridgeable, and getting wider every year. This is my final testimony, my attempt to bridge that distance while I still can. I am Malcolm of Fife, son of a merchant, soldier in Robert the Bruce's army, veteran of Bannockburn and a dozen lesser fights. I stood in the Schiltron on the 24th of June, 1314, and I helped win Scotland's freedom. I killed men whose faces I still see in dreams. I survived when better men died. I carried the weight of that day for 31 years, and will carry it to my grave. I do not know if what we did was right. I know only that we did it, that it mattered, that it changed history. I know that freedom has a price, and I know what that price feels like to pay. I know that victory is not glory, that war is not adventure, that the songs lie about everything that matters. And I know that I would do it again, that given the same choices I would make the same decisions, that even knowing the cost, I would stand in the Schiltron and hold the line. Because Scotland needed to be free, and freedom does not come from asking politely, and someone had to pay the price. We paid it. I paid it. And I am still paying it. Every day, every time I close my eyes and see the boy Archer looking up at me with his terrified eyes. Every time I remember Red Donald's laugh or Colin's prayers. Every time I walk past the field where we won and remember what winning cost. This is my witness. This is my truth. Remember it, if you can, when the songs tell you about glory, when the legends speak of heroes, when young men march off to war thinking they know what awaits them. Remember that behind every victory is a cost. Behind every legend is truth that is harder and darker and more complex than the stories suggest. Remember that the men who won your freedom were not heroes, but ordinary men who did extraordinary things because they had no choice, who paid for their choices in blood and guilt and broken dreams, who carried the weight of those choices until the day they died. I am nearly at the end now. My hand is too tired to write much longer. My eyes too dim. My memories too heavy. When this is finished, I will put the pages away, somewhere safe, somewhere they might survive after I am gone. Perhaps someone will find them someday, read them, understand what I have tried to say. Perhaps not. Perhaps these words will disappear like everything else, like the bodies buried beneath the grass, like the screams that echoed across Bannockburn that June morning so long ago. It does not matter. I have said what I needed to say, borne witness as best I could, put down the truth before the legend swallows it completely. The rest is not my concern. I am Malcolm of Fife, and I was there when Scotland won its freedom. I stood in the Schiltron, and I held the line, and I survived. That is enough. That has to be enough. May God forgive me for what I did, and may he grant rest to all those who died at Bannockburn, English and Scottish alike. The boy Archer, and Red Donald, and Colin, and the Earl of Gloucester, and Henry de Bohun, and all the thousands of nameless men who fell on that field. May they find the peace that has eluded me. May their deaths mean something, even if I cannot say what. And may those who come after us, who inherit the freedom we won, remember that it was not free, that it cost everything, that it was built on sacrifice and blood, and the broken bodies of men who believed in something larger than themselves. Remember us. Remember what we paid. Remember that freedom is never free. This is my testament. This is my truth. This is all I have to give. Malcolm of Fife, soldier of Scotland, this year of our Lord, 1345, 31 years after Bannockburn.